Welcome, the anointed ones. The moment you stop behaving the way people rehearsed you in their heads, confusion turns into noise. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. When something truly unprecedented happens, people don't respond with clarity. They respond with commentary. Not because they understand what just occurred, but because talking is the fastest way to regain emotional balance after control slips through their fingers. That's why everyone is suddenly talking. Group chats light up. Side conversations multiply. Names are being mentioned by people who haven't spoken to you in years. And yet, despite all the noise, no one can actually explain what you just did. There's a documented psychological fact behind this. When humans witness an event that violates their mental expectations, something that doesn't fit an existing category, the brain experiences what researchers call cognitive dissonance stress. In simple terms, the mind hates blank spaces, so it fills the gap with speculation, gossip, jokes, theories, and emotional exaggeration. That's not insight. That's panic wearing a microphone. What you did didn't break a rule. It broke a reference point. And that's far more disruptive. People can argue with rebellion. They can label chaos. They can even rationalize failure. But when someone makes a clean, intentional move that doesn't come from anger, desperation, or explanation, the system freezes. It's like watching someone walk off a chessboard while everyone else is still debating strategy. And here's the slightly funny part. Because yes, there is one. Half the people talking aren't even upset. They're just uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable where someone laughs while saying your name, then suddenly gets quiet. The kind where they say, I don't know, something about it just feels weird. Translation: their mental script crashed and IT support is unavailable. So now you've become a topic. Not because you made noise, but because you removed predictability. Not because you explained yourself, but because you didn't need to. Everyone's talking, yet no one can give a straight answer. And that's not an accident. That's what happens when a move is made from a place most people never visit. Clarity without permission. Stay with me. Because once you understand why this reaction is happening, you'll never feel the urge to explain yourself again. Number 1, you broke a pattern. People were secretly using to predict you. People don't pay as much attention as they claim, but they do track patterns, quietly, subconsciously. They notice when you usually hesitate, when you usually explain yourself, when you usually fold, when you usually stay. Over time, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a sequence. If this happens, then that follows. If pressure is applied, you respond this way. If ignored, you return. That's how they stay comfortable around you. Not because they understand you, but because they think they can forecast you. What you did shattered that forecast. The confusion didn't come from the action itself. It came from the fact that it didn't match your previous behavior. You didn't react the way history suggested you would. You didn't stall. You didn't soften it. You didn't add disclaimers to make it easier for others to digest. You moved in a way that wasn't emotionally available for prediction, and that's what triggered the noise. People don't talk this much when something bad happens. They talk this much when their mental shortcut stops working. Suddenly, all the little assumptions they relied on feel unreliable. The version of you they thought they had figured out doesn't show up anymore. And instead of admitting that their understanding was shallow, they scramble to reinterpret your move in a way that restores their sense of control. That's why the stories start. You're being labeled, reframed, psychoanalyzed, joked about, even admired in strange ways. Not because they know more now, but because they know less. When predictability disappears, people don't sit with uncertainty. They rush to replace it with meaning. What makes this unsettling for them is that you didn't announce the change. There was no warning arc, no visible struggle they could monitor. One moment you were familiar, the next moment you were not. That kind of shift forces people to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were never reading you deeply. They were just tracking your habits. And once habits stop defining you, access to you disappears. That's why the reaction feels disproportionate. You didn't just change direction. You removed yourself from their internal map. Now they're talking loudly, not to understand you, but to calm themselves down. Number 2, you acted without needing their reaction to validate it. Most people live like their decisions are invitations for approval. Every step they take is quietly asking, is this okay? Or, will this upset anyone? They check the mood of the room, scan faces, weigh opinions, and adjust before they even move. That's why when someone acts without that constant background of approval seeking, it creates a ripple that feels almost dangerous to observers. They aren't angry at the move itself. They're unsettled because it reveals how dependent they are on feedback loops to feel safe. You didn't ask. You didn't gauge reactions. You didn't pause to make sure anyone was comfortable with your choices. You moved straight through, confident in the timing, the reasoning, and the impact. That's a level of independence most people haven't experienced firsthand, so it's confusing, almost alien. People naturally want to place everything in a framework they understand, and your action refuses to fit into any framework they have. The effect is immediate. They scramble to explain what happened, but nothing fits. They can't reduce it to cause and effect because your motivation wasn't externally dependent. You acted from an internal compass, and that makes your action uncontainable. It's why they talk, speculate, and replay it in their minds. They're trying to reconstruct a rationale where none is necessary. Acting without needing validation isn't arrogance or defiance. It's self-trust, and self-trust makes people uncomfortable because it exposes their own hesitation and insecurity. They realize that if someone can act cleanly without asking for permission, then their own constant checking, justifying, and overthinking is optional. It's a mirror they aren't ready to hold. Your move doesn't just disrupt the immediate situation. It disrupts their assumptions about how the world works. It forces them to admit that someone can exist fully autonomous, untethered to their approval, and still function, still thrive, still change the outcome. That's why it feels unexplainable. You didn't just make a choice. They realized that validation was never required for real progress, and that terrifies them more than words could ever convey. Number 3, you escaped a mental role. They had already assigned you. Most people don't notice it, but we live in a world full of pre-written roles. From the moment someone meets you, they begin casting you. You're not seen as you. You're seen as a function in someone else's story. Maybe you're the helper, the underdog, the scapegoat, the easy target, or even the person meant to fail. They learn your patterns, your responses, your hesitations, and they start folding your identity into their script. It's convenient, it's predictable, it keeps them in control. When you step outside that assigned role, it's catastrophic for them. Not because you did something wrong, but because the narrative they relied on suddenly collapses. They don't know what to do with you anymore. They can't place you in the hierarchy they built in their minds. And humans hate that kind of ambiguity. It triggers confusion, defensiveness, and an urgent need to fill the void with explanations, even if none exist. Escaping a mental role doesn't require fanfare. You don't have to announce a transformation or justify a shift. You simply stop performing the part they expect. You refuse to be the predictable puzzle piece in someone else's design. That silence, that lack of conformity, becomes louder than any words because it exposes the reality. They never knew you at all. They only knew the version of you they could manipulate or categorize. The fallout is immediate. People scramble to rationalize your behavior. They gossip, they speculate. They assign motives that weren't there. They act as if the story is still under their control. But it isn't. You've stepped off the stage they built for you and into the space where your choices belong to you alone. That freedom is terrifying for them because it forces them to confront a harsh truth. All their assumptions, judgments, and attempts at control were illusions. Escaping a mental role doesn't just change how they see you, it changes how they see themselves. When someone refuses to fit into the mold they've created, it forces them to admit that their understanding was never deep, never accurate, and never fair. And that's why they panic, why they talk endlessly, and why no explanation can ever satisfy them. Number 4, you made a move that didn't match your past trauma. People get used to seeing you through the lens of your history. Every scar, every struggle, every moment of vulnerability becomes a blueprint for how they expect you to behave. If they've witnessed pain, they anticipate fear. If they've seen hesitation, they expect hesitation to continue. If they've watched you bend, they assume bending is permanent. They don't see you, they see the shadow of your past projected onto the present, and they build their assumptions on that projection. When you act in a way that doesn't match that narrative, it creates a shockwave. The move doesn't just surprise them, it shatters the mental architecture they've constructed around you. They're expecting someone who carries the weight of previous wounds, someone who responds in predictable ways rooted in survival or trauma. But you stepped out of that expected reaction. You moved from clarity instead of fear, from decision instead of hesitation, from intention instead of reaction. That makes you unexplainable to them. It's not that your action is complicated, it's that it's unprecedented in their experience of you. People don't panic over ordinary actions. They panic when the script they relied on no longer applies. Their shock is a reflection of their own limited imagination, of how they've confined your identity to a collection of past struggles rather than a person capable of choice beyond pain. What's particularly unsettling for them is that your move demonstrates self-possession. They've been trained to expect that trauma dictates behavior, and when you act outside that expectation, it highlights their own conditioning. They realize that being defined by history is optional, and that realization makes them restless and defensive. Your independence from your past doesn't just confuse them, it forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth that people can heal, adapt, and act from clarity rather than fear. And because they were never ready to witness that, all they can do is talk, debate, and speculate, trying desperately to fit a new reality into the old story. But the story no longer exists. You're not the version they've cataloged, and that's exactly why your move leaves them speechless and scrambling for answers. Number 5, you didn't announce your growth, you demonstrated it. Most people think growth is a story to be told. They believe that the world needs a warning, a justification, or a display before progress is acknowledged. They announce it, they post it, they explain it in endless paragraphs and captions, because that's how they've learned to validate themselves, through the approval of others. What they fail to understand is that real change doesn't ask for attention. It commands it silently through action. You didn't make an announcement. You didn't stage a reveal or look for applause. You simply acted differently, and the difference was undeniable. Every choice, every move, every reaction carried a subtle but unmistakable signature of evolution. That kind of growth cannot be debated, it cannot be reasoned with, and it cannot be anticipated. People talk about it because their minds are struggling to process something that defies their expectations. They want to explain it, categorize it, or label it. But the truth is, there is no label strong enough to contain it. The reason this is so disorienting is that most observers are conditioned to measure change externally. They need a visible struggle, a dramatic confrontation, or an explanation rooted in conflict. They need the performance of growth, but you demonstrated it in a way that made their measuring tools useless. You didn't need to justify, argue, or prove yourself, and that independence triggers both awe and frustration. By demonstrating growth instead of announcing it, you shifted the power dynamic without lifting a finger. People are forced to witness, interpret, and react without ever gaining control. They feel compelled to talk, to speculate, to assign motives, because they can't reconcile the clear reality they just saw with the story they've told themselves for years. Your growth isn't performative, it's undeniable. It exposes the patterns others rely on and reveals just how dependent they've been on assumptions, predictability, and the limitations of their own understanding. That is why it feels unexplainable, why it leaves people scrambling, and why no amount of words will ever replicate the impact of what you simply became. Number 6, you refuse to perform emotion for their comfort. Most people live in a world where emotion is a currency. They expect it to be displayed on cue, to match the situation, to provide a predictable rhythm for interaction. They want tears when sadness is appropriate, laughter when happiness is expected, outrage when injustice appears. They want your reactions to serve as proof that the universe is behaving the way they think it should. When you refuse to perform emotion for their comfort, you disrupt that rhythm entirely. You break the invisible contract that says your feelings exist for their observation. You didn't cry when they expected it. You didn't rage when baited. You didn't dramatize, exaggerate, or soften to make them feel secure in their interpretation of you. Your emotional independence is terrifying because it exposes the way they've been using others' reactions as a map for their own behavior. They relied on your responses to feel normal, to feel in control, to confirm that their assumptions were correct. By withholding performative emotion, you suddenly became unreadable. You stopped being a predictable node in their emotional ecosystem, and that silence of expectation creates panic. This is not coldness, this is clarity. You are choosing how to feel, when to express it, and under whose influence, if any, it will manifest. And that is a level of self-possession most people have never experienced. They scramble to explain your composure, to rationalize your restraint, because it violates every subconscious pattern they use to understand human behavior. The effect is immediate. Conversations, judgments, and observations start spiraling. People try to replay every interaction to find a crack, a clue, a justification, but there isn't one that fits. You've exposed a reality they don't want to face. Emotion is personal, not performative, and your choices belong to you alone. By refusing to perform emotion for their comfort, you've done more than protect your inner life. You've revealed how much of the world operates on dependency and expectation, and that revelation is unsettling. You didn't just step outside their understanding, you demolished the framework they were using to contain you, leaving them talking, speculating, and ultimately powerless. Number 7, you took power without asking permission to be resented. Most people move through life as if every step of success must come with approval, or at least some negotiated resistance. They subconsciously wait to see if others will tolerate their advancement, if their choices will spark admiration, jealousy, or outrage, and then they adjust accordingly. Power in their world is transactional. It's earned not just by achievement, but by the way it's packaged to fit the expectations of everyone watching. You didn't operate that way. You moved decisively without consulting anyone's comfort level, without seeking permission to upset, impress, or intimidate. You simply took what was yours. This is what makes your action unexplainable to them. They are accustomed to a world where boundaries, authority, and success are negotiated through social currency. You ignored all that. You didn't check if people would be pleased or threatened. You didn't measure reactions before advancing. By acting first and claiming your space without apology, you revealed a freedom most people have never seen. That freedom is both awe-inspiring and frightening. It disrupts the unspoken power balance, forcing observers to confront that someone can exist independently of their approval or resentment. The reaction they have, the endless talking, the speculation, the attempts to justify your behavior is not about you. It's about their discomfort with a new reality where control is stripped from them. They realize that the rules they relied on, the hierarchy they believed in, and the leverage they assumed they had are suddenly irrelevant. And because this shift bypasses their expectations entirely, their instinct is to scramble, narrate, and rationalize rather than admit the truth, that they've been powerless all along. By taking power without asking permission to be resented, you've demonstrated self-sovereignty. You've acted in a way that cannot be contained, predicted, or mitigated by anyone else. That is why it feels unexplainable. People can gossip, analyze, and debate endlessly, but they cannot recreate the decision or the presence that allowed it to happen. You exist in a space beyond their scripts, and that alone is enough to leave them scrambling for answers that don't exist. Number 8, you ended a dynamic that benefited them more than you. Most people are used to relationships, partnerships, or situations that serve them first, often without ever admitting it. They operate on the quiet assumption that your presence, your energy, or your compliance exists for their benefit. They've grown comfortable with the convenience of your availability, the predictability of your tolerance, and the unspoken labor you've invested. When you remove yourself from that dynamic, when you step away from a situation where they were the primary beneficiaries, it creates chaos, not because they lost something, but because they never realized how dependent they were on it. Ending such a dynamic is more than withdrawal. It's a statement of sovereignty. You didn't simply stop participating. You refused to fuel a system that thrived off your sacrifice or predictability. That choice doesn't just disrupt the moment. It disrupts their understanding of power, loyalty, and expectation. They suddenly notice the imbalance they relied on, the ways they subtly benefited while assuming you were static, and the realization is uncomfortable, disorienting, and often infuriating. People scramble to explain your move because their narrative has collapsed. They talk endlessly, trying to assign motives, to project fears, to rationalize why someone would abandon a role that seemed tailor-made for them. They can't accept that the choice wasn't made to punish or test them. It was made for clarity, self-respect, and freedom. They aren't used to people acting in alignment with their own priorities, rather than performing for someone else's benefit. And that makes your move feel unexplainable. By ending a dynamic that benefited them more than you revealed truths they were too comfortable to acknowledge. You exposed their reliance on your consistency, their subconscious exploitation of your presence, and the limits of their understanding. You didn't just leave, you reshaped the context entirely. Their confusion, chatter, and attempts to process your choice are proof of the shift. They're reacting not to what you did, but to the new reality where they no longer control the script. You didn't take revenge, explain, or justify. You simply acted, and that action forced them to confront a truth they were never ready to see. Number 9, you made peace with being misunderstood. Most people live their lives trying to be understood. Every action, every explanation, every word is aimed at bridging the gap between their intent and someone else's perception. It's exhausting, and it traps them in a constant feedback loop where validation is the goal and freedom is the cost. They don't realize that the need to be understood is a leash. It keeps them bound to expectation, opinion, and judgment. You, however, refuse that leash. You acted, moved, and made decisions without the need for anyone to fully grasp your reasoning or your truth. This is why people are so unsettled. When someone refuses to clarify, justify, or simplify themselves, it removes the control they think they have. They're left trying to read meaning into things that exist on their own terms, not for anyone's interpretation. Your clarity doesn't require translation. Your choices don't need annotation. By stepping into this state, you exposed a reality most people are allergic to. The world doesn't revolve around their comprehension, and someone can operate fully outside their understanding without consequence. The power of being misunderstood lies in its immunity to debate. If you are understood, your actions can be negotiated, critiqued, and resisted. If you are misunderstood, no argument sticks, no explanation contains you, and no assumption about your intentions holds true. People talk more in these situations because they're searching for a framework that doesn't exist. They try to assign meaning, but you've made it clear that your actions are sovereign, not performative. By embracing misunderstanding, you also dismantle their need for control. They can no longer measure, predict, or manipulate you through narrative. Their theories, gossip, and analysis are irrelevant because you're operating on a level they weren't meant to access. What they feel as confusion or agitation is really the shock of encountering a person who has finally stepped out of the constant cycle of external validation. When someone makes peace with being misunderstood, it changes everything. The commentary, the speculation, and the attempts to rationalize your choices become noise, and that noise is proof of your freedom. You didn't just refuse to explain yourself, you redefined the rules of engagement entirely. Number 10, you didn't replace them. You outgrew the entire context. Most people think progress or change is about swapping one thing for another, replacing the old with the new while staying within the same frame, the same boundaries, the same expectations. They assume that when someone moves on, it's just a shuffle in their established world, a simple replacement that they can analyze and adapt to. You didn't do that. You didn't fit into the pattern of replacement because you outgrew the entire context. You shifted beyond the environment, the people, and the rules that had once contained you, leaving observers scrambling because they've never witnessed someone leave not for someone else but for themselves. This is what makes your move unexplainable. People can rationalize departures within predictable limits. They can justify betrayals, exits, or switches because it fits the story they know. Someone wanted more, someone wanted different. Someone found someone else. But when the context itself is outgrown, their frameworks collapse. The roles they assigned you, the influence they assumed they had, the assumptions they held about your behavior, all of it becomes irrelevant. You are no longer part of their equation, and that level of independence is incomprehensible to most people. Outgrowing the context doesn't require dramatics. You don't have to announce it or justify it. You simply expand into a space where the old rules no longer apply, and in doing so, you leave everyone else in the realm of confusion and speculation. They scramble to locate meaning, to define motives, to find a logical explanation for a choice that isn't designed to be explained. The dissonance they feel isn't about loss, it's about the collapse of control. By leaving the entire context behind, you also expose the limits of perception. People realize too late that they were never interacting with the real you. They were interacting with a version shaped to fit their expectations. That version no longer exists. You didn't just move on. You transformed the boundaries entirely, and in doing so, you forced everyone watching to confront the uncomfortable truth. Some people can outgrow systems, people, and expectations without apology, without justification, and without need for validation, leaving others talking endlessly while they catch up to a reality that isn't theirs to define. Number 11, you refuse to carry their emotional aftermath. Most people expect others to absorb the fallout of their feelings, actions, and mistakes. They operate under the quiet assumption that someone else will process, rationalize, and soothe the chaos they create. It's a subtle form of control, an expectation that your time, energy, and patience exist to make their world manageable. You refuse that. You didn't step in to unpack their confusion, manage their insecurities, or carry the weight of their emotional overreactions. By setting that boundary, you instantly became unexplainable to them. People are conditioned to believe that relationships, whether personal or professional, come with a built-in emotional labor tax. They expect compliance, justification, and emotional availability, especially when their behavior causes disruption. When you step away from that expectation, when you make it clear that your presence is not a container for their unresolved issues, it breaks their script. They talk, they analyze, they gossip, not because your action was wrong, but because it defies the rules they've been counting on. Refusing to carry someone else's aftermath isn't coldness or indifference, it's self-respect. It's understanding that your energy is finite and that the responsibility for their feelings lies with them, not with you. And when someone exercises this kind of autonomy, it's disorienting for observers because it forces them to confront a truth they've long avoided, that they can no longer manipulate the narrative through emotional dependence. The impact is immediate. Conversations spin out of control, speculation intensifies, and theories about motives start multiplying. Their frustration, confusion, or anger is loud because they're grappling with a reality where you don't perform for them. You don't explain, you don't justify, and you don't carry their chaos for them. By refusing to carry the emotional aftermath, you establish an entirely new standard of presence and responsibility. You are no longer accessible as a buffer, mediator, or emotional proxy. That disruption exposes dependency, forces accountability, and redefines the boundaries of interaction. The endless chatter and speculation is proof of the shift. They are talking not about your choices, but about the sudden absence of control over the consequences they assumed you would always manage. Number 12, you acted from clarity, not urgency. Most people operate in a constant state of urgency, whether they realize it or not. Decisions are rushed, reactions are reactive, and actions are fueled by pressure, expectation, or fear of missing out. Even when someone appears composed, there's an underlying current of haste pushing every move. You didn't operate that way. You acted from clarity, a place where timing isn't dictated by external chaos but by internal precision. That difference is what makes your move unexplainable to others. Clarity looks deceptively simple. There's no drama, no panic, no visible struggle. You didn't need to justify the timing or anticipate the reaction. Every step you took was deliberate, considered, and final. People are thrown off by this because most are conditioned to expect tension and visible effort when someone is making a big move. When there's no frantic energy, no visible rush, no obvious emotional signal, their brains struggle to process it. They start talking, theorizing, and speculating because they cannot map your calm into their framework of how decisions should happen. Acting from clarity requires a level of self-trust that most people have never cultivated. It demonstrates confidence without arrogance, decisiveness without aggression, and presence without performance. You are moving in alignment with your own understanding of the situation, not the narrative that others have built around you. That autonomy is deeply unsettling because it exposes how reactive and dependent others are. They realize that their own urgency is optional, but it's a lesson they aren't ready to fully admit. The effect is both subtle and seismic. People feel disoriented, even unsettled. They talk more, not because they understand what you did, but because they feel compelled to fill a void they can't control. Every theory, every conversation, every attempt to rationalize your move is a reflection of their own inability to operate from clarity. You've demonstrated that precision doesn't need spectacle, decisions don't need validation, and action doesn't need chaos. In that space, you are untouchable by expectation, unshakable by gossip, and impossible to predict, leaving everyone else scrambling to explain something they can't replicate. Number 13, you exposed how loud confusion gets when authority is lost. People are rarely comfortable when the sense of control they rely on disappears. Authority, whether real or perceived, gives structure to chaos, a way to organize thought, behavior, and expectation. When someone removes themselves from the influence of that authority, intentionally or by acting outside its framework, the result is disorientation, and that disorientation is louder than any argument. You exposed this truth. You acted in a way that disrupted the invisible hierarchy they depended on, and the noise that followed wasn't about you. It was about the collapse of their own internal order. When authority is destabilized, the human mind scrambles. People start talking more, speculating more, even projecting motives that don't exist. The louder the confusion, the more obvious it becomes that the system they relied on was never as solid as they believed. Your move made them realize that their sense of control was conditional, fragile, and dependent on your predictability. And because you refused to conform, their usual tools for regaining order, blame, explanation, manipulation, suddenly failed. That's why the reaction seems chaotic, even irrational. It's not about your action itself. It's about the vacuum you created, where their authority used to stand. By acting outside their control, you revealed a universal truth. Most people rely on external anchors to feel competent, secure, and relevant. When that anchor is removed, the instability is unbearable, and the noise becomes deafening. They talk, they strategize, they debate, not because they understand, but because they're trying to reconstruct a framework that no longer exists. Your clarity, independence, and refusal to perform within their expected boundaries forced them to confront an uncomfortable reality. They were not in control, and nothing they could say or do would restore the balance. You became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of authority when confronted with someone unwilling to be contained. That loud confusion isn't a sign of your mistake. It's proof of your power, your unpredictability, and the unshakable autonomy you claim in a world built on expectation and control. Number 14, you became proof that their limits were never universal. Most people carry invisible boundaries they mistake for truth. They believe that what they can't do, what they can't endure, or what they can't achieve applies to everyone. Their world is built on limitations, timelines, expectations, habits, and fears that feel permanent because no one around them challenges them. Then you act, you move, you succeed, you make choices that defy the invisible ceiling they've unconsciously accepted. And suddenly, the rules they thought were universal are exposed as fragile and subjective. You become evidence that possibility exists beyond their imagination, and that realization is destabilizing. This is why their reaction is so intense. They aren't just surprised by what you did. They're unsettled because your actions contradict the framework they've built around reality. They've always assumed that people operate within predictable boundaries. You didn't. Your move isn't a violation, it's a demonstration. It forces them to confront a reality they weren't prepared to see. The limits they accepted for themselves were never absolute. They were convenient, unchallenged constructs. Your actions highlight the uncomfortable truth that most boundaries are mental. People spend entire lives staying small, waiting for permission, or justifying why certain things aren't possible. When you act outside those self-imposed constraints, it isn't just your freedom on display, it's a mirror showing everyone else the choices they've denied themselves. And that reflection makes them uneasy, argumentative, and obsessed with explanation, because they are suddenly forced to evaluate their own mediocrity, complacency, and dependence on limitation. By becoming proof that limits are not universal, you shift the perception of possibility for everyone around you. You reveal that independence, clarity, and self-possession are attainable, and that fear, hesitation, or external expectation are optional. Their chatter, speculation, and attempts to rationalize your behavior are all echoes of discomfort, proof that their mental maps have been redrawn without permission. You didn't just move beyond their limits, you exposed them, and in doing so, left them scrambling to reconcile a truth they weren't ready to accept. When you look at everything together, it's clear why people are talking, but cannot explain what you just did. Every move, every decision, every step you've taken has been a deliberate act of autonomy. You broke patterns, acted without needing validation, escaped the roles they assigned you, and made choices that defied the expectations set by your past. You didn't announce your growth, you demonstrated it. You refused to perform emotion for comfort. You took power without asking permission to be resented, and you ended dynamics that benefited them more than you. You didn't replace anyone. You outgrew the context entirely. You refused to carry the emotional aftermath of their chaos, and you acted from clarity rather than urgency. You exposed how loud confusion gets when authority is lost. And most importantly, you became proof that limits are never universal. What this shows is profound. When someone operates from self-possession, independence, and unshakable clarity, the world around them can't process it. People panic. They speculate. They scramble for explanations that don't exist. And the reason they can't explain you isn't because your actions are mysterious. They're because your actions are real. They are unbound by expectation, untouchable by assumption, and impossible to contain within the frameworks that most people cling to for comfort. This is the quiet power that leaves observers talking endlessly while never truly understanding what happened. It's not a trick. It's not luck. It's sovereignty, clarity, and courage in action. So remember, your power isn't measured by applause, reaction, or comprehension. It's measured by your ability to act fully, deliberately, and independently, regardless of what anyone else thinks or says. The chatter, the gossip, the endless debates, they are simply proof that you've disrupted their world, reshaped the rules, and claimed a reality they were never prepared to witness. If this video opened your eyes, inspired you, or challenged the way you see your own power, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with anyone who needs to hear this truth. Your support helps bring more clarity into the world and reminds everyone that real change is seen, not explained. God bless you.